Welcome to the debate. If you wanted to learn how to do a backflip, you wouldn't just sit in a quiet library reading a physics textbook about, gravity and momentum.
Right, that would be terrible advice.
Exactly. You would get on a mat and you would start falling. You'd physically try it. Yet, when adults attempt to learn a new language, we often abandon the mat entirely. We retreat right back to the library.
We treat it like a math problem.
Yeah, like an equation to be solved rather than a physical reflex to be trained. So today, we are examining the mechanics of language fluency drawn from our source material. We are looking at a foundational tension, specifically the conflict between active, daily, imperfect practice, treating language like a muscle, versus the more traditional academic focus on accumulating grammar and vocabulary before engaging in real-world use.
And it is a fascinating tension because it cuts right to the heart of cognitive science. We are really asking, what is language at its core? Is it a physical, athletic habit that you can essentially just muscle your way through? Or is it a complex structural framework that requires intense intellectual assembly before it even functions properly?
Right, and I take the position firmly rooted in our source text, which is that language is primarily a behavioral skill. It is a muscle that demands daily active production. The premise here is that consistency over intensity and immediate use, even if that use is highly flawed, is really the only way to actually achieve fluency. The text argues quite persuasively that waiting for grammatical perfection is, it's a trap that keeps learners permanently silent.
And I take the contrasting perspective. I challenge the text's dismissal of formal grammar and intensive study. Treating language purely as an athletic reflex, I think, deeply oversimplifies how cognitive acquisition actually works. While I entirely agree that usage matters, absolutely, discarding the structural foundation risks cementing persistent errors and trapping learners in a very shallow level of communication.
Let's start by looking at how the brain actually processes and retains information, because this is where the text makes its strongest initial point. The brain is fundamentally pragmatic. It is a ruthless optimizer.
The pruning mechanism.
Right, exactly. The text gives a highly relatable example. A learner studies 10 new English words. They write them down in a notebook, feeling very accomplished. But a week later, they remember perhaps 3. A month later, 0.
Yeah, that is the classic pruning mechanism at work.
Precisely. And why does it prune that specific data? Because the brain constantly discards information that it deems, unimportant for survival or daily functioning. The brain doesn't care that you want to pass a language test. It cares about what you actually need to navigate your environment.
To expand on that biological mechanism, the brain evaluates utility based on context. Visual data or spatial awareness gets prioritized because, it keeps you from walking into traffic.
Sure.
But a list of foreign vocabulary words, to the brain, those are just arbitrary acoustic signals. Unless those signals are tied to a social or survival utility, the neural connections carrying them simply dissolve to save energy.
Which makes perfect sense. Therefore, immediate daily use is the only mechanism that signals to your brain, hey, this matters. Keep these connections active. Even if you were just speaking to yourself while making tea in the morning, describing your actions aloud.
Right.
That physical act of speech shifts those 10 words from passive, disposable data into active, essential vocabulary. The physical production forces the brain to retain the tool.
The text certainly leans heavily into that behavioral model. But, it sets up a false dichotomy between perfection and practice.
How so?
Well, the text suggests that learners are paralyzed because they are waiting to know more grammar, and the solution is to just start speaking regardless of structure.
Which breaks the paralysis.
It breaks the silence, yes, but does it build fluency? If a learner simply repeats basic, unanalyzed phrases without a structural foundation, without understanding the mechanics of what they are actually saying, they aren't achieving fluency. They are functioning like a tourist reading from a phrase book.
I think that's a bit harsh.
But it's true, right? Yes, usage is important to signal retention to the brain. But if you don't have the grammatical scaffolding to understand how those words relate to one another, you cannot generate new original thoughts. You are just a tape recorder playing back the same 10 words.
But let's look at the analogy the text uses to counter that exact point. Riding a bicycle. You can read volumes about the physics of a bicycle, the gyroscopic effect of the wheels, the mechanics of the gears.
Sure.
You can possess a perfect structural understanding of the machine, but that knowledge will not keep you upright when you get on the saddle. You still have to feel the balance. I would actually extend this with my own analogy. Think of it like a musical instrument.
Okay, I'm listening.
You can read sheet music all day. You can understand music theory, time signatures, and scales. But until you physically press the keys on the piano, it isn't music. Language, as the text insists, is meant to be used. It is a physical act of communication, not just a theoretical framework sitting in your prefrontal cortex.
I come at it from a different way. A bicycle is a simple, closed, mechanical system. Even your piano analogy, while beautiful, has limitations.
Does it?
Yeah, a piano has exactly 88 keys. It is finite. Language, however, is an infinite cognitive system. Human language is generative.
Meaning we can create completely new sentences at will?
Exactly. We have the capacity to construct an infinite number of sentences we have never heard before, to express completely novel ideas. The text points to practicing simple daily conversations. Things like, I woke up early, I had breakfast, and practiced English. Rote repetition of those basic patterns does not magically scale up to infinite generative capacity.
But those basic patterns serve as the foundation.
A foundation of what, though? If you just memorize the chunk, I woke up early, but you have no concept of irregular past tense verbs or syntax placement, you cannot dynamically adapt that to say, I should have woken up earlier, but my alarm failed.
Well,
Without the very grammar rules the text actively downplays, you hit a cognitive ceiling very quickly. You end up with a collection of isolated phrases, not a fluid, adaptable cognitive tool.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what the goal of those simple, repetitive patterns actually is. The text explicitly states that the goal of repeating these simple conversations is not to sound advanced. The goal is to train the brain to think directly in the target language.
By bypassing the grammar?
By bypassing the translation phase entirely. When you get bogged down in the structural mechanics you're advocating for, when you are constantly analyzing whether to use the past perfect or the simple past, you engage a translation mechanism in your brain.
You're analyzing, yes.
Right. You think in your native language, run it through the grammar algorithm you've painstakingly built, and then attempt to output the new language. That delay is exactly what causes the mind to go blank in real conversations. By automating simple phrases through repetition, you create a direct neural link between the thought and the utterance.
But bypassing translation by relying on fixed, memorized chunks only works in highly predictable situations.
Most of daily life is predictable.
But what happens when the conversation inevitably deviates from the script? What happens when the friend you meet doesn't just ask, "What did you do this morning?" but instead asks a nuanced question about a complex geopolitical event or a deep personal issue?
That is where the text's point about athletic repetition comes in. The text argues that successful learners understand that repeating basic conversations isn't boring, it is powerful. It builds the core strength required for those harder, unscripted maneuvers.
Like a drill.
Exactly. An athlete practices the exact same fundamental movements thousands of times to create mastery. We don't ask a basketball player that constantly invent new ways to shoot a free throw. We ask him to perfect the underlying physical mechanic so that, in the heat of the game, the shot is automatic.
But a basketball player isn't penalized if their form is slightly unorthodox. As long as the ball goes in, language is different.
The text draws a direct parallel to children here, which I think is crucial. Children do not wait until they have a firm grasp of syntax to start talking. They blurt things out. They make constant grammatical mistakes, they receive feedback from their environment, and they self-correct. They learn through the messy, imperfect act of athletic repetition.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The adults should learn like children argument is one of the most persistent misunderstandings in language acquisition. Adults are simply not children.
In terms of neuroplasticity, you mean?
Yes, absolutely. A child's brain possesses a completely different level of neuroplasticity. But crucially, a child has tens of thousands of hours of passive immersion just listening to their parents and their environment before they even utter their first sentence.
They have a long silent period.
Right. They are absorbing structure long before they produce output. Furthermore, an adult has an already fully developed linguistic map of their native language, which constantly interferes with the new language.
Which is exactly why the text wants adults to stop overthinking and just start speaking, to break that interference.
But you cannot simply ignore the reality of how the adult brain hardwires habits and just tell learners to make mistakes. Let's look at the mechanism of myelination.
Okay.
When you repeat a physical or cognitive action, your brain wraps those neural pathways in myelin, which acts like insulation on a copper wire, making the signal travel faster.
Right, making the language automatic, exactly as the text suggests.
Yes, but the brain doesn't care if the sentence is grammatically correct. If you constantly practice speaking with broken, incorrect grammar, you myelinate the error. You hardwire the mistake. This is called fossilization.
Fossilization?
Yes. The error becomes so automatic that it is incredibly difficult to unlearn later.
But the fear of making those mistakes, the fear of fossilization, is exactly what paralyzes adult learners in the first place.
The text is trying to get them off the sidelines.
True, but let's look at a massive contradiction within the source material itself regarding this. The text champions just jumping in and speaking with mistakes, but then it strongly recommends a technique called shadowing.
Shadowing being the process of listening to a native speaker on a podcast or video and imitating their pronunciation, rhythm, and common expressions in real time. Exactly. Do you know what shadowing actually requires from the brain? It requires intense analytical attention to structure, form, and phonetics. You have to hyper-focus on stress timing, on vowel reduction, on exactly how the words link together.
It's an active exercise.
It is an incredibly precise structural exercise. It completely contradicts the earlier advice to just start speaking even if your grammar is a mess. Shadowing is fundamentally about correctness.
See, I don't see that as a contradiction at all. Shadowing is about rhythm, prosody, and the physical feeling of the words in the mouth. It is about the musicality of the language, not parsing syntax trees.
But you have to be precise.
Sure, but when the text advises learners to speak along with the audio rather than listening passively, it is reinforcing the core thesis. Active imitation trumps passive textbook exercises.
But it requires massive cognitive load.
It does, but the analytical attention you're describing might happen subconsciously. The conscious experience of the learner doing the shadowing is highly physical. They are feeling the flow of the sentence. They aren't stopping the tape to diagram the sentence structure on a whiteboard. They are training the mouth, the tongue, and the vocal cords to move in new ways.
But if they are just mimicking the rhythm without mapping it to grammatical meaning, they are essentially just humming a tune without knowing the lyrics.
They know the lyrics because they are using material scaled to their understanding. And if shadowing requires the kind of intense, hyper-focused cognitive load you were talking about, it begs the question of sustainability. How long can a learner actually maintain that level of focus before burning out?
That is a fair point.
Which naturally brings us to the text's most practical application of its philosophy, the approach to the daily habit itself.
The debate between consistency and intensity.
Precisely. The text argues firmly that consistency is vastly more important than intensity. 15 minutes of daily practice, even just reading a short article or doing a 5-minute shadowing exercise on a low motivation day is immensely superior to studying for 3 hours once a week.
Just to keep it going.
Yes, the goal is to keep the language active in the mind, to not break the chain. It's the compound interest of language learning.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the actual mechanisms of growth versus mere maintenance?
What do you mean?
I agree that 15 minutes a day is excellent for maintaining a baseline. It prevents the atrophy of the muscle, to use your metaphor. It keeps the language alive, but compound interest works in finance because money passively accumulates. Cognitive development requires progressive overload.
Progressive overload, meaning constantly pushing the difficulty?
Right. Think about your gym metaphor. How do you build physical muscle? You don't build it by lifting a 2-pound weight every day for a year.
Well, no.
That maintains joint mobility, perhaps, but it doesn't build strength. You build muscle by lifting a weight heavy enough to create micro tears in the muscle fibers, forcing the body to repair and rebuild them stronger.
And how does that map to language?
True expansion of capability, moving from a beginner to an intermediate, or intermediate to advanced, requires cognitive micro tears. It requires productive struggle.
Struggle.
Yes, it requires those intense, focused sessions where you are stretching your cognitive limits, struggling to parse a complex conditional clause, or negotiating a difficult text. If you spend your 15 minutes every day describing the weather or saying, "I am making tea" to yourself, as the text explicitly suggests for those unmotivated days, you will certainly become world-class at talking to yourself about tea.
But you are maintaining the habit.
You are, but you will not develop the vocabulary or the structural agility to negotiate a complex real-world opportunity. You won't be able to articulate a nuanced opinion in a business meeting or navigate a deep emotional conversation. 15 minutes of low-stakes repetition does not push the boundary of your competence. It caps your ceiling.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it completely ignores the profound psychological barrier that prevents most learners from achieving fluency in the first place.
The anxiety.
Yes, the primary obstacle for most language learners isn't that they can't handle complex business negotiations. The obstacle is that their mind goes totally blank when someone asks them for directions on the street. They freeze.
Due to the affective filter.
Exactly. The intense 3-hour grammar sessions you're advocating for, the progressive overload, are exactly what build up that affective filter. They build the anxiety that you must construct the sentence perfectly in your head before speaking. The text's ultimate promise is that by normalizing the daily low-stakes use of the language, you dismantle that anxiety.
I see.
By consistently using it for 15 minutes in mundane situations like making tea, you build a state of mind where translating in your head stops entirely. You stop viewing the language as a massive intellectual test to be passed and start viewing it as just another ordinary part of your day.
I don't disagree that lowering anxiety is crucial. The psychological component of language production is massive, and freezing up is a very real phenomenon. But we must be very careful not to confuse comfort with competence.
They are related, though.
Feeling relaxed when you say, "I am making tea" is wonderful. But if you want to reap the real-world benefits the text mentions, like communicating globally and creating better opportunities for work and travel, comfort alone isn't enough.
But comfort is the prerequisite to those interactions.
It is a prerequisite, yes, but it is not the totality. You need precision, and precision requires a deliberate, structured, intensive study of how the language actually works, not just a behavioral habit of making noise.
Well, let's pull back and look at where we've arrived. My position, defending the core thesis of the text, is that language acquisition is primarily a behavioral habit. It is built through daily, imperfect, active exposure.
Right.
By treating language as a physical tool that must be used constantly, whether through describing your morning routine to yourself or shadowing a podcast, you signal to your brain that the information is vital, preventing it from being pruned. You bypass the crippling hesitation of internal translation, and the language eventually becomes an integrated, automatic part of your daily life.
And my position remains that while that daily practice is undeniably necessary, treating language purely as athletic repetition deeply limits a learner's potential. If you prioritize behavioral output while neglecting structural intensity and grammatical foundation, you run the very real risk of myelinating and fossilizing your mistakes. True fluency requires not just the courage to speak, but the cognitive scaffolding to speak with clarity, generative complexity, and adaptability.
Despite our different lenses, I think we both find a point of strong convergence rooted in the text. Passive learning alone is a dead end.
Absolutely.
Watching countless videos, hoarding vocabulary lists in a notebook, and reading textbooks without ever opening your mouth is universally insufficient. The language must be actively engaged.
We are completely aligned there. Information input without behavioral output leads nowhere. Where we diverge is whether that imperfect active production is the actual engine that creates fluency, as you argue, or if it is merely the expression of underlying structural study, as I would suggest.
It is a profound distinction, and one that suggests the source material offers much more to explore, particularly regarding how we align our daily practice with our actual real-life communication goals. There is a lot to unpack about how the brain balances the need for structural rules with the messy, unpredictable reality of human conversation.
Indeed, it forces us to ask what we really want out of a language, to simply be understood or to truly master the instrument.
And perhaps that brings us right back to our gymnast on the mat, or our pianist at the bench. Whether you lean heavily on the underlying theory or throw yourself entirely into the physical repetition, eventually you have to perform.
You have to execute.
You have to jump and you have to strike the keys. The theory and the practice must eventually collide. The real question is how you choose to spend your time before that moment arrives.